So, good morning. I think it's time to proceed. So we will continue today. This morning we have two contributions to lectures. So the first one will be the continuation of the lecture of Isaac Villaña yesterday on microscopic approaches to the equation of state, nuclear matter, asymmetric nuclear matter, and its implications in the understanding and structure of neutron stars. So,
so on the second part for the next 1 hour and a half something, I thought I will try to present you some of the theoretical approaches that people have developed in order to build the nuclear equation of the state. So the first I cannot. It was working until now. Anyway. Sí, ¿no? ¿Está entendido? No. Anyway. Okay. Okay. So the first thing, So the first thing I want to tell you that is basically there are two philosophies that people have followed in order to build the nuclear equation of the state. And one is the kind of ab initio philosophy or ab initio approaches. So in this case, basically the starting point is a there, 2 nucleon and also 3 nucleon, or in general 2 baryon or 3 baryon interaction. Realistic, when I say here realistic, I mean interaction that reproduce or are built in order to reproduce the scattering properties and the neutron properties. And then with this starting point, the point is that you have to solve or try to solve the many body problem in order to build the nuclear equation of a state. And there are different types of models. I will basically present here these 4 types of the well-known Brunner-Bethe-Boson theory. Then there's an approach which is self-consistent green function 1. Then, of course, the variational approach, and then some quantum Monte Carlo methods. And then on the other side, there are another type of approach, which are more phenomenological. In this case, the starting point is an effective density-dependent interaction, which has some free parameters that are typically adjusted in order to reproduce observables, nuclear observables, or properties of nuclei, or also properties of compact objects. And in this case, I will basically present 2 most famous ones, non-relativistic approaches like the Scarab-Bonnier forces, and then some relativistic mean field approaches. And okay, these approaches will be basically for homogeneous nuclear matter, but of course, in the neutron star, there is a region on the more external part, which is the crust, and this is non-homogeneous matter. And then for the non-homogeneous matter case, there are also other approaches which are phenomenologically and have been specifically developed to treat the clusterized matter. So let me move to the ab initio approaches. And it's maybe a question. Yeah.
When you are talking about these different approaches, you are mainly discussing in the 0 temperature limit, or you are also considering.
Okay, so in general, I will concentrate on the T0 case, but in fact, the self-consistent green function is developed at finite T a priori. But so what I will present is just for T0, except the self-consistent, which by construction is built at finite T. So for the ab initio, let me just start with telling you which are the main difficulties for ab initio approaches. The first one is that, well, yesterday I tried to show you that there are different models in the market for the nucleon interaction. And all these interactions are, no, it's not good. All of them are phase shift equivalent. But there are many of them. So the first question, okay, which interaction should I use and which one? And then what will be the difference on the final result depending on the interaction I'm using? And of course, the main problem is that the nuclear interaction is strongly repulsive at the ratio of distances, which means that the short-range correlations are very important. And mostly the difference between all these different ab initio approaches are coming from the way all these short-range correlations are treated. And there are different ways to do that. And of course, I mean, related with interaction, the interaction itself is very complicated because it has complicated channel and operator structure with different pieces as I showed yesterday. Central spin, spin tensor, spin orbit. So it's a very complicated interaction. And on top of that, you impose a many body machinery, which by itself is not easy. So let me move to the first of these approaches, which is the Bruckner-Bethe-Goldstone theory. So the idea of all these approaches is that what you want to do in the end of the day is try to solve the Schrödinger equation of a many body system. This is the problem you want to solve. The problem is that because of the fact that the barium-barium or nuclear-nuclear interaction is so complicated, and in particular the short-range pair is very repulsive, this a priori is very difficult to solve. I mean, you cannot apply perturbation theory directly to this guy because it's simply not going to converge. So the idea behind, for instance, this Bruckner-Bethe-Goldstone theory method is the following. So you start from your nuclear Hamiltonian, which contains the kinetic part and the interaction. Okay, here I have restricted to the two-body part, but of course you have also three-body forces and even multi-body forces. But just to simplify, let's concentrate only on the two-body part. And then what you do is, okay, you introduce something auxiliary, which is typically called an auxiliary single particle potential field, which is completely arbitrary a priori. And then the idea is, okay, well, if you choose this auxiliary mean field potential in a relatively clever way, you can simply rewrite your Hamiltonian as a pair which contains just something that you will just simply consider the unperturbed pair, and then something which contains the interaction minus this and this. If you choose this cleverly, this quantity, this H1 is small, and then you can, in principle, try to apply perturbation theory. So this is the basic idea behind the method. So at the end of the day, the energy of the event, in particular the ground state energy, will be just the unperturbed pair, which is simply this is nuclear matter, so this will be just the Schrödinger equation where you have here like the determinant plus some correction coming from perturbation theory. This is ready. So formally, perturbation theory gives you explicitly how you have to calculate this correction. So you have an infinite number of pieces here. Now the idea is that, okay, what appears here explicitly is the uncorrelated wave function. So what you can do is, okay, you write using the Lehmann-Springer equation, you write the correlated wave function, so the real wave function of the system which contains the effect of all the correlations in terms of the uncorrelated wave, simply by using this Lehmann-Springer equation. So when you do this, formally, I mean, the correction for the energy is given by essentially this matrix element where you have the correlated wave function, this perturbation operator, and then the uncorrelated one. And here you have basically the projection of the correlated wave function of the uncorrelated one. And then Goldstone, in the end of the 50s, he showed that, in fact, this matrix element here can be factorized as a product of a piece, which is exactly this projection here, times something that can be calculated only taking into account what is called linked diagrams. So these are diagrams which cannot be split in two pieces without cutting an interaction line. So this guy, what he did is, okay, he managed to write this correction to the energy simply as an infinite sum of diagrams which are unlinked diagrams. And then you have, so these dotted lines are the very interaction. And then you have the different contributions, first order, second order, third order, and so on and so forth. And there are pieces here, though these pieces here, we have this cross here, these are the single particle auxiliary potential insertion. So these are these terms coming from the one, which a priori, if you sum everything up to infinity, should cancel, because this is also added here. So all these contributions from these diagrams, if you add everything to infinity, should not depend on the choice of the potential. But of course, you will not do that. So what you will do in the end is to make a clever choice of the potential such that you don't need to sum many of these diagrams, because then you have some convergence of the series. Okay, this is usually called in the literature the Goldstone expansion. But the problem is that this is still not enough. I mean, it's a clever way because it provides a simple and in principle explicit prescription for calculating the correction of the energy. But again, the problem is that this is an expansion in which you are still using the bare interaction. And again, this is non-perturbative because you have a short range repulsion, and this makes any of these matrix elements very large. And simply, if you simply try to sum everything like that, it will not converge in the end of the day. So the idea, or the next step, was introduced by Bruckner, and he said, okay, what we have to do is we have to try to make some partial summation here. We have to replace the bare interaction by something which is softer and takes into account the short range correlations. And this is a so-called Bruckner reaction matrix or G matrix, or depending on how you look into that. So what he did is, okay, he looked into this infinite series of diagrams and he performed a partial summation of a particular type of diagrams. In particular, what he did is, okay, let's consider, for instance, just the direct thesis here. So this diagram which contains one interaction line, two interaction lines, three interaction lines, and so on and so forth. And you have an infinite number of these guys. So if you sum partially all this number of diagrams, in the end of the day, you have a contribution to your energy, which is formally identical, let's say, this same type of diagram. But the only difference is that instead of the bare interaction, which is repulses at very short distances, you have replaced this by an effective interaction in the medium, which is formally given by an infinite sum. In fact, this is just an infinite sum of all, and this is called ladder diagram, constructed because you have basically all this ladder series here. So this gives you this prescription to obtain an effective interaction in terms of the bare one, and this is formally identical if you look into this equation in a compact way. It's basically an integral equation that gives you the G matrix in terms of the bare interaction, and it's formally identical to the scattering equation in the free space, in the Liebman-Zwinger equation. So in some sense, this equation, which is called the Bruckner-Goldstone equation, what gives you is the scattering G matrix. It describes the scattering of two nucleons or two baryons in general, but in the media. So there are medium effects that are, of course, not in the free space. And the medium effects are mainly coming from two things. This Q, which is a Pauli operator. So we are working with fermions, and it means that if you are going to scatter two fermions, the final state should not be occupied. Otherwise, the scattering is simply forbidden. And this is taken into account by means of this operator. And in addition, you don't have only the kinetic energy in the energy denominator, but you have this H0, which remember is just the kinetic energy plus the mean field. So it contains the effect of the mean field, or the interaction in a mean field way from the rest of the nucleons. So this is in fact, okay, this is what meant. These two main medium effects that are taken into account. So then when you do that, you do all these partial summations, and then you can rewrite all this Goldstone expansion series, but now in terms of the G matrix. And then you get this series. I mean, if you expand all the G matrix, you get, I mean, always the same series. All the diagrams are simply resummed here. But when you group this in this way, you get something different. You get now an expansion in terms of the G matrix. And now the point is that the thing is that if you look individually to each one of these diagrams, what Bruckner notices that the contribution to the energy per particle of the system of a given diagram with a number of whole lines, so whole lines are lines which propagate backwards in time. So all these lines that are going down. So if you count the number of whole lines, the contribution to the energy per particle is essentially proportional to the density of the system to a power which is the number of whole lines minus 1. So in the end of the day, it means that what you have here is an expansion basically in terms of the density. So you have a kind of polynomial where the different pieces are powers of the density. And the important thing is that if you look into nuclear matter, okay, you can have nuclear matter at very high densities, but it's a dilute system. In the sense that if you compute the ratio between the average density distance between two nucleons, so this R0, which is related with the inverse of the density, and let's say the typical value of the core of the interaction, this is much smaller. So even if at very high densities, infinite nuclear matter is still a dilute system. So you can try to compute the energy of the system and other properties in terms of expansion of the density, even if the density is high. It's high, but it still is a dilute system. And this is the tricky thing. So if you now take this series and then you order according to the number of fault lines, you have this expansion, which formally is an expansion on the density, and then you can simply compute the energy at different orders on this expansion. So the lowest order essentially corresponds to the, again, there are still diagrams which contain this single particle potential that if you sum everything, in the end of the day will disappear. So at the lowest order, so that this is what is usually, okay, is the two-body, two-fold line expansion that basically corresponds to these two diagrams. So this is the direct piece and this is the exchange because we are working with fermions. This gives you the lowest order in this expansion, and this is usually called the Bruckner-Hartree-Fock. Bruckner, because okay, this is the Bruckner theory, and Hartree-Fock because in fact you simply replace this G matrix by a bare interaction. What you have is just the Hartree-Fock approximation. So this is the lowest order. And then of course corrections start to appear at 3-fold lines, 4-fold lines, and so on and so forth. So, but this is the prescription. So if you want to compute the energy per particle of your system in the Bruckner-Hartree-Fock approximation, what you have to do is you have to basically solve first for the G matrix, and then when you have the G matrix, compute the energy. And this is a self-consistent procedure because to obtain the G matrix, here you need, of course, H0, and this means that you have to compute the auxiliary potential, which is basically given at the Hartree-Fock approximation.
Isaac,
Yeah.
you have there that the G matrix depends on omega. What do you fix this omega? Or could you
This is the starting energy. Yeah, sorry. So this omega here is just the initial energy of the two incoming nucleons. So this is a scattering G matrix. So if you want to describe the scattering, this is the initial energy of the two nucleons.
Yeah, but in practice, for example, at the end when you have compute the energy, this on the Hartree-Fock, which omega do you use?
Well, you have to take it consistently. Can I? Okay, the point is that in the end of the day, when you want to compute, let's say, by the end of the day, you have the energy that will be, and then you have the sum of the potential mass that in the end is just the and this is basically the sum of the mean field, which depends on the momentum. So in the end of the day, what you have is diagrammatically for the single particle potential, what you have is essentially this is the contribution that when you integrate this produce this contribution here, and then you have the exchange term, which is basically okay, like this, but this is not for the energy, this is for the auxiliary potential. One of the possible choices for the auxiliary potential. Now to compute this guy, formally what you have to do is simply an integral of the matrix element. But here you need an energy. So this energy will be essentially the energy of the incoming nucleon, this guy here, whatever, this is not relativistic, plus E of k, plus the energy of this guy here. So the guy that is integrated here. We call it Ek. So this is basically compute. So you plug omega for a given value of k, and then in the end of the day, you compute it should be self-consistent because basically the spectra that appears here is also the spectra that is here. So but it's just the initial, the starting energy. The energy of this nucleon plus the energy of this hole here. But of course, this hole is changing momentum from 0 to kf. Okay. So the last the word I want to say about this method. I mean, as I said at the beginning, so everything starts from the fact that you choose a single, an auxiliary single particle potential, which is arbitrary. And if you choose cleverly, then it means that you will accelerate the convergence of all these series or not, depending on which you choose to do. So typically on the literature, two types of choices have been used for the single particle potential, and this is just a plot which shows the energy per particle of symmetric nuclear matter as a function of the density, assuming the two lines, so the solid line and this dashed line, correspond to a calculation at the two whole line levels, or the lowest order in this expansion, and then the dots is the result when you include the three whole line terms in this expansion. And well, the first thing you have to notice is that you don't saturate properly, but this is because this is a calculation only made with two-body forces, so saturation is not reproduced properly. So the saturation point is at much larger densities, but this is because of the fact that two-body forces are not included here. So the first choice is if you look into literature, this is normally called the standard choice or the gap choice. So basically it means the following. So you assume that the single particle potential is basically given by the integral of the G matrix if the momenta of your nucleon is below KF, or simply zero above. This is the first choice. And this is called gap choice because of that, because you have a jump on this choice. And then the other choice is this continuous one, where basically you assume that the potential is given by the Hartree-Fock approach of Brugner-Hartree-Fock, because here you have the G matrix potential for any momentum. And what is seen here is that the correction, so for instance, this is the calculation with the standard prescription, including contributions only at the two whole line level. And you see here, the correction here, when you go to the three whole line, is much larger than the correction that you get. Sorry. Than the correction that you get when you start with the standard choice. So this is this tells you that that tells you that if you make this choice or the continued choice, the series is converging much faster than if you choose the standard one. And also tell you that since the correction is not so large, to remain at the lowest order in this expansion is already quite good. Of course, the point is that you see these calculations are complicated. So this is the first and the only existing calculation of the theory at the three whole line, and there are no calculations with the next. So nobody has calculated the four whole line contributions, because I show here the diagrams, but in fact there are much more diagrams. So it's a really quite hard task to go beyond this three whole line. So this is one of the first possible methods. Of course, to improve the saturation point, you have to include three-body forces, and three-body forces are not easy to include sometimes. So normally, are included in an effective way. So typically, you start from a genuine three-body force, an average over the coordinates of one of the nucleons is done, and then you get a two-body force, but it's density dependent, and then you can simply add this to the two-body force, and then solve the G matrix. So this is a way of introducing three-body forces. And then typically these three-body forces have parameters which are adjusted in order to reproduce properly the saturation point. So the second method, which has is also a diagrammatic method, but has a different philosophy, is the self-consistent green function method. So here the main ingredient, or the most important piece, is the green function, the propagator. So in the self-consistent green function, the energy of the system is given by this expression, which is called the Galinsky-Migdal quantum sum rule, where basically you have an integral over momenta, over energies, kinetic energies, some energies, and then you have essentially two energy and momentum distribution. This is a method that was developed at finite T, so there is basically the Fermi-Dirac distribution here, taking into account some T finite T temperature effects. But the main ingredient is this guy here, the so-called single particle spectral function, or one body spectral function. And then this guy basically represents the probability density that if you remove or you add, because you can have, a spectral function of a particle part and a whole part. So if you add or remove a particle from your system with a given energy and a given momentum, the system remains with a given energy and moment. And in principle, all the quantities can be obtained, or the observables can be obtained from the single particle spectral function. The point is that the single particle spectral function itself is basically, well, basically it tells you it is a schematic plot. So if you have a, it gives you an idea of the, so you have a particle, or if you have really a particle, it tells you how the energy is distributed more or less. So you have a pronounced peak, which corresponds to the quasi-particle peak. And then you have some distribution. You have some probability that your quasi-particle have a wider momentum. So formally, this is obtained from the imaginary part of the one-body propagator, and it can be also rewritten in terms of the self-energy. So basically, it's given by the imaginary part and the real part of the self-energy. So all the game here consists of computing the self-energy. The self-energy, if you prefer, the equivalent will be the mean field in the media. So how this is done? Well, it's complicated, but the idea is that
if you will go to the non-interactive limit, what will be the value of this spectral function?
It's a delta function.
A delta function.
It's a delta function. Yes. So basically, when you have interactions, your particle becomes broad. So you have a quasi-particle basically, because you have the medium effects, and this transforms the delta into something, a kind of Lorentzian, more or less. So the idea of the method is the following. The first thing you have to do, as in the case of the Bruner, you have to calculate an effective interaction in the medium. In this case, it's called T matrix, but it's basically the G matrix in some way. And this is solved basically by also solving a kind of T matrix equation. So you start from a bare interaction, and then you have to solve this integral equation in order to obtain the T matrix. So it's basically the same as before. And then when you have your immediate interaction, then you solve in a given approximation the self-energy, exactly as in the case of the group. You choose some particular type of diagrams, and then you simply make the integral of the T matrix with respect to the whole lines, and this is the propagator, so the medium propagator. And then the medium propagator is given by the free propagator plus some correction, which contains the self-energy. And then, okay, once you have the medium propagator, you can compute the two-body propagator, which is what you will need here, and then you plug everything back into the T matrix. So this is an iterative procedure. So you start from a bare interaction, from an approximation. Typically, is the bare propagator for these two propagators here. You obtain a first T matrix, you compute the self-energy, which is already a correction, you recalculate the propagator, and with the propagator, you recalculate the T matrix. And everything is continuously done until you get a convergence result. When everything is, when you reach some convergence, of course, this is numerically obtained, you have your approximation for the self-energy, and then you can obtain the single particle spectral function, the energy, and any other. Okay, once you have the energy per particle, then you can compute the pressure or whatever you want. Okay. So that is the second approach. The third one is the variational approach, and this is simply is an approach which is based on the variational principle. So basically, what you will do is you have your. In this case, okay, let me say, because I mentioned that the big difference between the different methods depends on how you do the correlation. So the Bruner, Bell-Gosson theory, and self-consistent Green function, basically what you renormalize is interaction. So you put the correlations in the interaction in some ways. In the case of the variational, what you are going to build is a correlated wave function. So you don't touch the interaction, but you touch you want is to see what is the correlated wave function. So it's a different way. So either you put the correlations in the wave function, or you put the correlations in the interaction. So, okay, this is what the variational principle tells you. So what you are going to obtain with a trial function is just a lower bound of your system. And the idea is, okay, you start with an ansatz. So you assume that your wave function typically is taken in this way. So it's going to be the uncorrelated wave function. But if you are dealing with Fermat, this is going to be simply a later determinant. And then you have some functions, so correlator factors, which are going to take into account all the correlation of the systems. And then, okay, typically the ansatz is made on the form of these functions with different parameters that okay, you have to minimize. You minimize by imposing that the variation of this expectation value with respect to all the possible parameters of the correlator factors is zero. And this is going to give you the best answers for your factor. So this is in general. Of course, in the case of the nuclear interaction or the nuclear matter, it's a bit more complicated because the interaction is has a complicated structure. In particular, you have some channel dependence, and in fact, so these factors are not simply functions, are normally taken as operators. And normally what people do is, okay, they assume that the form of these correlator factors as an operator reflects the operator structure of the interaction. So typically in this kind of calculations, what has been normally used are potential of the type of argon. I mean, remember yesterday that I showed that this is, in particular, the argon 18 is a potential with 18 operators or different types of. So calculations based on the variational approach normally assume the same type of operators with some functions. It depends only on the relative distance of the different nucleons, and contains the parameters that basically you have to find by minimization. So if you look into the literature, the most probably well-known and famous equation of a state based on this approach is the Agmar, Pandare-Palde, and Rago. And this is just, if you are interested, this is the reference of this model. And there are other models which are based on the variational principle. One approach, which is this couple cluster theory, is this is okay, it's already quite old. In fact, if you look into the literature, this goes back already to the 60s. And then another, and I will mention later, you have the Monte Carlo version of this approach, which is the variational Monte Carlo. In this case, the idea is the same, but what you will do is basically you will perform this the integrals involving this to compute these matrix elements with a Monte Carlo method. So let me say something about the Monte Carlo approaches. So I will not enter into too much detail, but just to show you different approaches. Okay, the first one is the Monte Carlo, the variational Monte Carlo that I already mentioned. And here, as I already said, the idea is to evaluate the energy, or in principle the expectation value of another observable, by simply making Monte Carlo integrals. So typically what they use is the Metropolis algorithm. Then you have the diffusion Monte Carlo, and this is a method which the idea behind here is to transform the Schrödinger equation into a kind of diffusion equation by going from real time to an imaginary time, and then simply solve it in a stochastic way, so with some Monte Carlo technique. Then there are also other approaches which are based on the Green function. I mean, the most famous one is the Green function Monte Carlo. In this case, what you do is, okay, you assume, or you try to compute or try a wave function by sampling it, I mean, performing some path integrals of this form. And the most recent version of this diffusion Monte Carlo is the so-called auxiliary field diffusion Monte Carlo, which is basically the diffusion Monte Carlo method. But here there are some, because of the complexity of the nuclear interaction, there are some dependence on the spin and isospin operator, which are not linear, and they are basically transformed to linear dependent, which are more easy to treat by introducing some auxiliary fields, which well, I mean not basically because I simply don't have much idea what that. But I thought that they introduced this Huber-Statanovich auxiliary fields. And let me give you some details on these two methods, which are the most important. So the variational one. So the variational Monte Carlo, again, starts from the variational principle. And here the idea is, as in the case of any variational method, you have to choose a trial wave function, which depends on a number of parameters. And you choose this wave function, the most appropriate to your particular system. And then the idea is that okay, you have to compute this guy here. Of course, this is a multidimensional integral. And this is tricky to do numerically, so we're going to do with a Monte Carlo. And then in the end of the day, okay, you will vary the different parameters in order to obtain the minimum. So the point is the following. So this expectation value here, normalized to the triangle wave function, normally is written in terms of a given probability distribution function in this way. So a probability distribution function defined in this way, which is basically the square of the, okay, this is the probability density divided by the normalization. And then introducing this, you can simply rewrite your expectation value this way. So you have basically, no, sorry, this is not the expectation value. You introduce what is called a local energy, which is just the action of the operator of the Hamiltonian on the wave function divided by the wave function itself, and then all the integral can be rewritten in this way. So it's going to be simply the integral over all the coordinates of this probability distribution function times this local energy. And then you are going to perform this integral, for instance, using an importance sampling method. So the importance sampling, probably you know this method. So yes, okay, you have to choose a distribution of points, probability distribution function, which in general is not uniform. You have to choose it the most appropriate for your particular integral. And then the idea, okay, you choose this zone distribution function, which is normalized in a given interval. And then in the end of the day, if you choose this probability distribution function with that form, which is not so different from the integral you want to perform. Here you have to, okay, I use the same letter, but this f is not this here, it's just a generic function. So you get the best estimation for your integral, and then the error, and the error is minimized if you choose g relatively similar to the function you want to integrate. So the idea is, this is what you are going to do in the variation Monte Carlo. This is the most simple algorithm for the variation Monte Carlo that you can do. So essentially, you will start with an initialization of everything. Then you fix the number of Monte Carlo points and also thermalization points. And then you choose an initial value of the coordinates. And then the initial value of the corresponding parameters of your function. And then you define a step. And you initialize all the sums and the square of the sums to compute the expectation value and the error. Then you open a big loop of the Monte Carlo steps, and inside you open a loop on the thermalization points. So what you do is, okay, you make a trial. So you define a new point, which is simply the starting one plus something which is essentially the step multiplied by something which contains a random number which is generated between 0 and 1. And then you compute this ratio. So here you choose this distribution function g simply as this f that I define here, but evaluated now at the first point r, and then you take the ratio between this and the new point. And then you apply Metropolis. So you generate a random number, and if this random number s is smaller than this ratio, you accept it or not. And if you accept it, okay, you change r by r2. And you do this for all the thermalization points. So once you go out of the thermalization loop, then you can start to calculate the local energies and make an update of all the sums. So in the end of the day, you get your best estimation for the energy, which is going to be simply the integral divided by the number of Monte Carlo points, and the square is the error. So that is the basic idea behind the variation of Monte Carlo. Then you have the diffusion Monte Carlo. Diffusion Monte Carlo has an idea behind. I already mentioned you have to try to simulate or to solve a stuff, try to build or to transform the Schrödinger equation into a kind of diffusion equation. And this is done by introducing an imaginary time. So you simply introduce an imaginary time, which is simply I times the real time. Then you can rewrite formally the Schrödinger equation in this form. And if you forget for a moment on the potential part, this is just formally identical to the diffusion equation. And then you can either solve this solving any method to differential equations, or you can simulate it. You can simulate the diffusion of gas of particles statistically, stochastically. So the idea is the same here. Now, of course, what you are going to diffuse is not real particles. You are going to diffuse probability, basically, in the system. The point is that since you have this part here of the potential, it can be shown that because of this term here, the probability is not conserved in the system unless the potential is extremely zero. So depending on the sign of the potential, if the potential is repulsive or attractive, when you will evolve this equation, you will see in the end that the probability is either increasing or decreasing. So you're not conserving the probability. And this has to be corrected in some way. So in the diffusion Monte Carlo, what typically is done is that you introduce some reference energy here, so you modify your original equation, so you transform your Schrödinger equation in imaginary time from here to here by introducing, and then in the algorithm, basically you are going to play with this reference energy at each step in order that the probabilities always keep constant in the system. And when this is evolved at very large times, it can be proved that the system evolves to the ground state. And the energy that you will get in the end from this reference energy is the energy of the ground state. So this is the idea behind this. So just to give you some kind of picture plot. So you start, so you have some model, some potential here. So you start with a distribution of probability. So this is going to be the square of your wave function. And you can choose a kind of uniform distribution. And then at each time step, and here is again, it's an imaginary time. What you do is you simulate, so you can imagine that these are particles, real particles that diffuse. So you start your diffusion process. And then because of this term here, what you are going to do using a metropolis algorithm, for instance, is to decide whether in the next step your okay, normally what you diffuse are called Walkers, because basically it's a random walk what we are doing. Is going to disappear or you are going to create a new one in order to that in the end the total probability is really constant. I mean, it's constant, it's not decreasing or decreasing. And then you proceed this until at to very large time. So in fact, in principle, you don't really go up to infinity, but if you leave this system evolving for very large values of this imaginary time, in the end of the day, what you get is a final distribution of probability. There's a final square of the wave function, and of course, with this you can compute the energy of the system. So this is the idea behind, of course. The technicalities are much more complicated, and the algorithm is relatively complicated, but the idea is this one. That you start from an initial probability density distribution, you evolve this in an imaginary time, and in a very large times, this basically brings you to the ground state of the system. So before moving to the phenomenological ones, I want just to show you this plot. This is a comparison of different methods. So in fact, that is a paper that it's already quite old, but we wanted to show that time is okay. Let's consider different many-body approaches. Let's consider a very simple type of interaction, and in particular here we choose simple versions of the argon interaction with just four operators, 5 or 6, so in order to consider as much as possible, I mean, the most simple interaction in order to reduce the uncertainty. And then what we wanted is just to evaluate a kind of systematic or determined error that is coming from the many-body technique. So yeah,
in the examples you have mentioned, you always had kind of a localized wave function. But in nuclear matter, you have an infinite nuclear matter. What do you do in practice?
Well, I think no, these people work in a box, so they don't have an infinite number of nucleons. They have n whatever is. I think now as far as I remember, this Gandolfo, they even have 60 or something like that. I mean, a relatively large number of nucleons, but it's a finite system. So on practice, they simulate. Okay, in the end of the day, what they want is that when you extrapolate to infinite matter, you get the result for infinite matter, but on practice, they solve everything in a box, in a finite box with a finite number of nucleons. Okay, and there are other problems, which this is sign problem. I mean, it's much complicated than what I simply to show. So here is the question of the step for pure symmetric nuclear matter and pure neutron matter. The different panels correspond to this simple version of the Argov potential. So the small prime is just a potential which contains only the central term, the spin, isospin, isospin, and the spin isospin. So the most simple, no tensor, no spin orbit, no nothing. The 6 prime contains the next two operators, which are the spin orbit, and then okay, the prime means that all the parameters have been refitted in order to reproduce the deuteron and the scattering data. In fact, these are very simple interactions, but have been refitted in order to reproduce the data. And then, of course, then you have the complete interaction with the AP. And what we saw at that time is that only for the very simple interaction, so when you don't have an interaction which is too complicated, there is a relatively good agreement specifically for pure neutron matter between the different methods. Here you have this Bruckner has the Fock method, the self-consistent green function, which are these squares, and then some variational Monte Carlo, some variational method, which is this Fermi alternated chains, the auxiliary field, and then the BBG is the Bruckner up to threefold line, and then another Monte Carlo, the green function. And there is a good agreement for pure neutron matter up to relatively large densities, but only if the interaction is relatively simple. Then this is not anymore the case for symmetric matter, because even for the most simple case, you start to have difference already at 0.2, slightly above saturation densities. And then, of course, if you increase the complexity of interaction, this is, again, not anymore the case. Still, for pure neutron matter, if you have this 6 prime interaction, so with 6 operators, there is still at very low densities quite good agreement, but then, of course, everything departs. And for symmetric matter, the situation is much, much worse. But what that was one of the conclusions. It seems that most of the difference appears as soon as you include in your interaction the tensor and spin orbit parts, which are really making things complicated. So if you keep the interaction without tensor and with the spin orbit,
are those parts also responsible for the saturation? Because in the simplest one, you do not saturate.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. In fact, you don't see saturation. Yeah. You start to see saturation. I mean, not at the proper point, but you have saturation because of the tensor, exactly. But of course, it's telling you that okay, you can remove this part, but then you don't have an interaction with it. That's not saturate. So, but the message is that okay, apart from the many body technique itself, there are differences which are associated with the interaction. Right? Starting with in principle, with the same interaction. If it is simple, you have a relatively good agreement. If it starts to have more complexity, particularly when you include the tensor and the spin orbit, things start to depart.
But that means also the tensor and the spin orbit do not have really a very hardcore, no?
The tensor, no, I don't remember.
So this
hardcore tensor is coming from the pion chains, no?
It's the long range.
It's the long range.
So it's not really helping you for this hardcore for the saturation.
No.
Even a very high density.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's move to the second type of approaches, which are these phenomenological ones. And okay, traditionally, I mean, there are different types in the market. The most well-known and used the non-relativistic Skern and Gogny models. So just to give you an idea, that this is I mean, as I say, both are models in which you build an effective interaction that is going to work directly in the media. There are parameters which are fixed or fitted in order to reproduce data. So the Skern interaction is a zero range effective density dependent interaction. So I mean, everything that you have here is basically a contact interaction. And then basically what you do is okay, you evaluate the energy density of your system, typically in the Hartree-Fock approximation. And in the end, what you get is normally a relatively simple energy density functional, so that in fact, I mean, has all the dependence of the densities, partial densities or asymmetries of the system, or powers of the density. And there are many parameterizations. So if you go to the literature, you will see that there are more than 200 different types of Skern forces. The Gogny one is, I mean, in the philosophy is similar. The difference that this is a finite range, but it contains not only just contacted, but there are some finite range here from these Gaussian expressions. And okay, maybe it's probably more realistic, but the price that you pay is that because of the presence of this finite range, from the numerical point of view, is much more diffuse. And in fact, if you go to the literature, there are not so many parameterizations compared to the square one. So there are much less Gonies. Or I don't know if there are 6 or 7 Gonies, probably more, but no more than that, compared to the 200 of the square. And then you have the other philosophy, the relativistic one. So in the relativistic mean field approaches, the starting point is again is a Lagrangian, where the interactions are described by means of meson exchanges. And typically, what has been considered as just exchange of in the most simple version of the sigma meson, and then the more sophisticated, then you include also tensors, the vector mesons, so the omega and the rho, and even the delta. So typically, you have a Lagrangian which contains all the interactions with variance with the mesons, and then some self-interactions of the different mesons with themselves. So if you want to apply this for a neutron star matter, of course, then you have to include in addition to the hadronic contributions from the electronic values. So the idea behind is that well, is you start from this Lagrangian, and what you have to do is you have to derive the equation of motion, the Euler Lagrangian equation of motion for the variance and the fields. So for the variance, what you get is a Dirac equation with some modification. You have an effective mass here, and then you have mesons. And for the meson fields, you have typically this for the sigma, omega, and rho. These are the meson field equations. The next step is like once you have your equation of motion, normally you make an approximation, and in order to solve this, you take the mean field approximation, which basically consists of that what you are going to do is you are going to replace all your meson fields.
Sorry.
by the expectation values of these meson fields. And for the fields and for the baryon currents, exactly. You are going to replace the baryon by the currents by the corresponding expectation values. And then you get a set of equations already for the mean fields that you can solve numerically, and then you get your equation of state, which is obtained when you have the meson field. You can compute the energy momentum tensor, which is diagonal, and from the diagonal you can read immediately which is the energy density and the pressure of the system. Which for this particular model they look when they are compact. They are relatively simple to code. This kind of so
for the energy momentum tensor, it is built in that it is a question of state of
an ideal yes.
gas, or this is
it's an ideal gas because in the end of the day,
yes, but I mean it is because of the what you assume for the Lagrangian, or
I would say yes. I'm not sure, but
because this is a very strong assumption.
Yeah, but this is
well, you can read it there. If this comes from the Lagrangian, so it's building in the Lagrangian.
Yeah, I mean, when if you plug the Lagrangian that they from before, you get immediately that is this case. Yes. So then here there are parameters which are basically the coupling constants, and this for the nucleon sector normally they are constrained by using nuclear data, typically from nuclei or just to reproduce the properties of symmetric nuclear matter at saturation. If you have other variants like the hyperons, then here is a bit more tricky because the couplings are not so easy to fix. You can use data coming from the binding energies of hypernuclei or even compact properties. And this is typically done also for the couplings which are not well known. You can assume some kind of symmetries and relate the couplings of the hyperon with the ones of the nucleus by assuming typically SU3 or SU6 symmetries. So, this is the last almost the last transparency. So this is a comparison of, again, more or less I was tested before for the equation method. So these are the equation of state for kinetic matter, pure neutron matter, and asymmetric matter obtained with scalar forces and some bunch of scalar forces and some relativistic mean. And this is simply just to show that the difference between the different parameterizations are very large. And in particular, for instance, you can have, in the case of the scalar forces, that reproduce more or less by construction the same properties close to saturation density. But then when you go to high densities or when you go to pure neutron matter, the predictions are completely different. And in fact, I mean, there was some years ago, there was this paper here where these people here, they analyzed something like almost more than 200 scale parameterizations and some relativistic mean field ones. And what they did is basically they imposed some constraints in order to see how many of these interactions really survive. And what they found is that, in particular for the scalar forces, only a few of them survive. I mean, the complete set of constraints that they were analyzing. So the message is okay. There are many, in particular, scalar forces, but well, in the end of the day, I mean, these are forces that normally are built to be used in a particular region of energy or whatever, or region of densities. And then, of course, if you want to extrapolate or use them in another context, normally happens that they simply don't work. But they are popular and people are used. So let me say something on the low energy region of the neutron star, in particular on the crust. I already mentioned yesterday a bit on the crust. So the crust is a region of the star which is about 1 kilometer, not thick, not so much, and it contains very few percent of the total mass and the radius of the star. So it's basically not doing its contribution to the mass of the star is basically negligible, but it's very important. And it's very important because it's the last layer apart from the atmosphere and the surface, and any information that comes from the interior has to cross this region. So it's important to know which are the properties of the crust, because all the information that we will obtain from the interior is going to pass this region. So in particular, there are some observables which are really dependent on the physics of the crust, like the glitches that yesterday were mentioned at some point, some thermal relaxation in some X-ray transients, and some what is called quasi-periodic oscillations. So the crust, here you have a plume of this region, essentially can be divided in two regions, which are, again, it's a bit arbitrary, this division. So typically, the division is done at the density of the neutron drift, typically. So this more external part is the outer crust, and here matter is basically made of nuclei, which are forming a kind of Coulomb lattice. And in addition, there is an electron gas, which is relativistic, and when you go to higher and higher densities, it becomes ultra relativistic at some point. And then typically the shape of the nuclei, okay, is it's basically changing when you move from the external part to the interior. Typically, let's say you start from kind of spherical nuclei more or less, and then at some point because of the increase of the densities, you start to obtain some more exotic configuration or shapes of the system. The interior of the crust, as I said, this is defined at the neutron drift density, and what you have basically here is that okay, when you increase density, at some point, so you start to have a lot of electron capture processes, and the neutrons and then therefore in the neutrons, the nuclei in this lattice are more and more neutron rich when you go from the external part to the interior. But at some point, they are not anymore bound. At some point, you produce a new neutron, and you do it at a density where neutrons are not anymore bound, and then you, in addition to the electron gas outside of the cluster, you start to produce a neutron gas, which in addition is superfluid. And this is what when you enter in this inner part. And then, as I said, in addition, the shape of the nuclei in the lattice, they are not anymore spherical. So they start to get exotic configuration or topologies, and these are the so-called pasta faces. Typically, you have different. In a very simple picture, you have like a kind of elongated shapes or planes or whatever, but in reality, it's something much more complicated. Until you reach densities of the order of 2/3 saturation density, where everything melts, and then you enter in the outer core of the star. But okay, anyway, since with respect to the question of state, so this is matter, which is not uniform. So at this moment, there are no ab initio calculations based on realistic interactions, which are from which you can describe the question of the state of this clusterized and non-uniform matter on the crash. So normally the question of state for the crash is typically obtained from phenomenological approaches, and there are different types of models, but all of them basically can be classified into two types of approaches. There's one type which are so-called single nucleus approximation approaches or models, in which in this case you assume, or people assume, that the composition of the matter in this cluster is made of just one representative type of nucleus, plus maybe some light nuclei like alpha particles, and of course the nucleons which are around. And then in this type of models, I mentioned just 3 of them. There are the so-called comprehensible liquid drop models, or based on the liquid drop model. There are some Thomas Fermi models or extended Thomas Fermi, and then there are some self-consistent mean field models in which basically you try to solve in the heart. It's a Hartree-Fock calculation basically. So you assume that this cluster are kind of nucleus, and then you apply basically the same type of approach. And then there are the other type of model which can be classified generically as nuclear statistical equilibrium models, in which, in this case, instead of assuming that you have just one representative nucleus or heavy nucleus, what you have is a statistical ensemble of nuclei of different species and in thermodynamical equilibrium. And here, well, just to mention 2, there are the original nuclear statistical equilibrium model or the extended versions, or models which are based on the virial equation of the state. I will not, basically because I don't have much time.
Exactly, just a small question. But in this region, the pressure of the star is dominated by the electrons.
Let me see. I don't have a plot here. No, I would think so. Yes.
So it means that these models are to define the composition of the matter, but not the pressure.
Yeah.
No, I think neutrons start when once you arrive to the neutron region, no, then to the 7. Then neutron pressure starts to compete with electrons, but before.
Yeah, in this region. Yeah.
But it still has an impact in the structure. I think you are right, but for example, we have a seminar recently where somebody were arguing that the crash on the estimation of the radius may give you an uncertainty of 1 kilometer, depending on which crash equation of the study.
Yeah, so for the mass, they don't play almost any role, but it's good for the radius. Yes. Okay. Anyway, in both, this type of model, basically the idea is you describe the nucleons either as a uniform of interacting particles, of the ones, the nucleons which are basically moving around, or the ones which are clusterizing basically they are inside some clusters. And normally what is employed is the bigness size approximation. So basically you divide you assume that your matter is basically made of different cells, where you have your cluster basically in the center, and then this is surrounded by the electron. And then, of course, what you have to do in the end of the day to compute the equation of the state is that you have, for a given condition, given density, given temperature, or whatever, you have to minimize the free, if you have a finite energy density or the energy density with respect to all the possible variables that you consider. Here you as a variable or variable that can be varied atomic mass, atomic number of the cluster, the volume of the cell, which is also a parameter, the different densities of the free nucleons which are outside, and of course, if you also consider the exotic shapes, you have also to minimize with respect to the geometry of the shape you consider. So this is everything you have to consider. And now I'm entering at the end. This Pepe will mention, I have a lecture on the consensus. I will just basically make a list of different constraints, but I will not give too much detail. So okay, what I presented up to now, okay, are some approaches for the nuclear equation of the state, but then the point that what do we know from the experiment or from observation in order to build a state? And basically, we know we know the masses, radius, and the properties of more than 3,000 isotopes, and we know, at least for the nucleonic sector, relatively large number of scattering data. And we know something else. We also know that if you are not so far from saturation density, and you are not so far from the symmetric situation, which you have the same number of neutrons and protons, you can characterize or try to characterize the behavior of the equation of the state close to this situation, to the symmetric one, and not so far from saturation, in terms of a relatively small number of parameters. So isoscalar parameters, which basically are the energy at saturation, the incompressibility. This Q0 is the squeeze. I don't remember. Anyway, this is the third derivative of the energy per particle with respect to the density. And also for another 3 or more parameters, we start describing the isovector part. And in principle, these parameters, so basically you perform a Taylor expansion of the energy per particle around saturation, not so far from the symmetric matter case. And this parameter in principle can be constrained from experiments, from nuclear experiments, and also from astrophysical observations. Of course, the point is that this expansion is valid. You are not very far from the point where you are expanding. And then, of course, I mean, if you want to go to higher densities or symmetries, then everything for your prediction have to rely on theoretical models and have to be tested with observation, in particular astrophysical observations. So let me mention just a few of the concepts, but I will not enter into details because Pepe will do it. So, for instance, you have constraints on the density and the binding energies. Basically, the density from elastic electron scattering experiments come from hadron proof, where basically you can deduce that the value of the density of saturation is the typical number of 0.16, 0.17 Fermis to the 3. The binding energy, I mean, the measurement of nuclear binding energies allows, of course, to identify the value of the energy per particle at saturation, the binding energy at saturation, and also, for instance, the volume part of the symmetry energy. And these are just some numbers, I say it recent, but there are not so recent. Some estimations using some Scared-Hartley probability models. Then also nuclear resonances. So in particular, the measurement of the excitation energy of the nuclear resonance can be used to determine some of these parameters, in particular the incompressibility coefficient, but also the symmetry energy. So for instance, in particular, the isoscalar GM monopole resonance. So the analysis of the excitation energy of the resonance allows to determine or to put constraints on the incompressibility parameter. This is a number which is on the order of 200 something MeVs. When you go to the isovector part, the analysis of isovector G and dipole resonances, this allows you also to put some constraints on the symmetry. In particular, this analysis has allowed more or less to determine that the value of the symmetry energy, or the volume part of the symmetry energy, not at saturation density, but slightly below, is something between the order of 23, 24 MeVs, and the same the other coefficients like the class derivative of symmetry energy, and this is coming from the analysis of also scalar EM quadrupole resonances and the isovector EM and the peak media resonances. So also the study of the skin thickness of the neutron skin thickness in heavy nuclei by means of for instance, parity violating electron scattering can be used or impose some constraints on the symmetry energy and on the stress derivatives. I want to mention a very recent result, but I will not of the SPIRREX-2 experiment, where basically they determined the skin thickness of the neutron skin thickness in lead 208, and basically from this new measurement in the constraints they deduce okay, it's questionable, but the symmetry is something that is between 34 or 42 MeV, which is a very large range of variation, and also for the first derivative of the symmetry energy. So something similar from the electric dipole permeability. And of course, there are also constraints coming from heavy ion collision. But from heavy ion collision, one have to be careful because, of course, the point that here there are many models in the market, and most of these models basically then they do not depend directly on the equation of state, but they depend on the medium cross sections and also on the mean field of the nucleus. And then the point is that well, this is a kind of natural question that arises: that how much the results that can be expected from heavy ion collision are really depending on the transport code that is employed for the analysis. Because basically, they analyze data, but in the inputs they have in the codes, some say, I mean, it's in some say bias. So they have already put some ingredient, which is basically what they want to extract. So it's tricky. But anyway, this is just a list of different observables which are sensitive to the nuclear symmetry energy in particular, either in the regions of subsaturation densities or at supersaturation densities. Well, and this is just a question. The point, I mean, the symmetry is still quite uncertain, and the question is why is so uncertain? And probably the answer is that well, we are still, our knowledge is limited on the nuclear interaction. It is clear, and in particular, it's very limited. Our knowledge on the spin and isospin dependence of the nuclear interaction. So we don't know yet very well how the nuclear interaction is. So let me move to the final part, which are the statistical constraints. So as I mentioned yesterday, I mean there have been measurements of neutron stars with two solar masses, but the masses, as I mentioned also yesterday, can in principle be measured only in binary systems. So there are no measurements at this moment of masses of isolated neutron stars. And then here the idea is for any binary system, in particular for a binary system of neutron stars, you can measure 5 orbital parameters, which are called classical, the Keplerian parameters, which are essentially the period of the orbit. You can also measure the projection of the semi-major axis along the line of observation, which is basically this combination. So you have basically the semi-major axis times the sinus of the inclination of the orbit with respect to the observer. And then in principle, you can also determine the eccentricity of the orbit and two angles, which are the time of the periastron and the longitude of the periastron. So these are 5 quantities which can be observed, not only for a neutron star system, but for any binary system, planet or whatever you want. And there are 3 quantities which are known, which are the masses of the 2 objects which are in the system and the inclination of the orbit with respect to the observer. So this is not is also something that is not observable in principle. But you can do something. Okay, you can combine using just Kepler's third law these quantities, and from here, you can deduce a function which is called the mass function, which essentially relates these three unknown quantities with the quantities which are observed, the period. But this is just one equation. So you have one equation and three unknowns. So if you don't have anything else and any other information, you cannot go beyond that. But and this is the good thing of neutron star, is that these guys are relativistic objects. And then there are additional parameters which are only in systems where general relativity effects are really important, which in principle can also be detected and be measured, and can give additional equations to solve this system. So these are the so-called post-Keplerian parameters, and then the idea is that you only need to measure two of these, because you have already one constraint, which is this mass function. So if you measure two of these post-Keplerian parameters, then you have a complete system of three equations with three unknowns, and from here you can deduce the masses and the inclination of gravity. And this is just a list of these 5 of these parameters. So and these are purely relativistic. So these are parameters that only appear when your system is really a relativistic system. So you have the advance of the periastron, some time dilation and gravitational redshift, the so-called Shapiro delay. In fact, these are two parameters. One is as the range, and the other is as the shape. And then you have variations of the period due to the gravitational wave emission. So if you measure two of these, and this is just an example from the Pulsar-Taylor pulsars, in this case, these two guys, they were able not to measure only one, but 3 of them. With one of them, essentially, where and in fact, this was one of the motivations for the Nobel Prize, they confirmed that general relativity is really a very precise theory. So this, but in addition, they also measured two additional two. One is this Einstein coefficient, and the other one is the advance of the periastron. So with these two, basically they were able to solve the system and obtain with a very high precision the masses of these two objects. So this is a classical example, but recently this has been also done for 3 systems which have allowed to obtain for the first time, and then with relatively high precision objects with 2 solar masses. So the first one of them is this Demoritz pulsar, which was observed already 11 years ago. So and the most recent one, which is this guy here. And in the 3 cases, basically, if you look into the numbers, they are very similar. So the 3 guys are it's a binary system where you have a neutron star, which is a millisecond pulsar, and the mass is about 2 solar masses in the 3 cases. The 3 of them, in addition, are in systems with a very low eccentricity, so the orbit is almost circular. And in the 3 of them, the companion is a white dwarf. So this means that this is not causal, so there should be something common on them. And probably what is common is the formation of these objects. So probably, this is just an hypothesis, but probably these 3 guys follow more or less a similar history. And this is more or less a cartoon which tries to explain the possibilities. So imagine you have a binary system of 2 ordinary stars, one which let's assume that is an evolved object, a massive object, and the other one for the moment we don't say anything for this. So this guy evolved, so it finishes life, it explodes in a supernova, and then imagine at this point we have the first possibility. If the explosion is very violent, the system simply breaks, and then you finish with a young pulsar, which is an isolated guy, and then an ordinary star, which is just running away. But imagine that this explosion is not so violent, and after the explosion of the supernova, the system still survives. So you have a pulsar and a companion, which is an ordinary star. And now we start to see what is the evolution of the companion. So if the companion, the companion evolves at some point, and then at some point, of course, imagine, okay, it goes through the different phases. At some point, it starts to accrete matter on the pulsar. And then it continues its evolution. So if this guy is also a massive object, you will have a second supernova explosion, which will produce either, again, if this is very violent, 2 pulsars, which are essentially isolated. One is the new one, the young one, and the second was the previous one, is merely recycled in the sense that has accreted matter and has accreted some angular momentum, so it's spinning much faster. if this explosion is still not so violent, you can finish with a system of 2 neutron stars, which are still orbiting one or the other. But this is not the case of these 3 guys. Probably these 3 guys are following this other path. The path in which this guy is not a very extreme massive object. So it spends most of the time in the main sequence, which means that it has a lot of time to transfer matter and angular momenta to the first pulsar. And this is probably why the pulsar, the first one, reaches 2 solar masses because it's a fleeting matter on the companion, and it's also spinning very fast because the companion is giving a one momentum. So probably these 3 guys have been following a kind of scenario of this type, more probably. Of course, this is an hypothesis. Okay, but this is just the present scenario. So because of the observation of these 2 solar mass objects, very important constraint for any reliable equation of state is that any model or any equation of state you build should fulfill these conditions. So the maximum mass that predicts will at least be of the order of 2 solar masses. Otherwise, they're not compatible with observation. So for the radius, in principle, from a theoretical point of view, they cannot be arbitrarily small. There are constraints that tell you that there should be a minimum radius. So just from general relativity, so a neutron star is not a black hole. It means that at least will be larger than the sparse radius. But there are also constraints from the fact that the pressure of matter, I mean, you cannot compress matter at will. So there is a limit in the compression, and this also imposes you value, minimum value of the radius. And of course, causality. So speed of sound should be smaller than the speed of light, and this also gives you a maximum value. And then to measure the radius, this is complicated because the radius, there are 2 reasons. These are very small objects, typically are 10 kilometers radius, and they are very far from us. Just to give you an idea, the closest pulsar to us is this object here, and it's about 400 light years. So we want to measure 10 kilometers on an object which is at least 400 light years. So it's not easy, but it's not impossible. And the idea here is to use the thermal emission of, in particular, a type of binary system, which are the slow mass X-ray binaries that I mentioned also yesterday. So here the idea is to measure the flux of X-rays and use this measurement in order to obtain the radius. So the idea is the following. So you have a measurement of the detection of the flux. Then you assume something, which is typically the Stefan Boltzmann law. You should have an estimation of the temperature. So you assume some atmosphere model, or you simply make a black body fit. You have to make an estimation of the distance because you have to correct what you will measure from what you already observe. And then you also need some gravitational speed correction from the detection of some absorption lines. So you have all these ingredients, then you can deduce the radius. So this is the radius at infinite, which again, after you correct from the redshift and so on, gives you basically this relation, which of course, this is an implicit equation, which in addition, you need the mass. So in the best of the cases, what you have is an estimation of the radius, but of course you need, I'll let you know the mass, but you are going to have this some constraints. And well, some years ago there was some analysis of the same sources. So in fact, these were 5 by the same low mass X-ray from 2 different groups, but the conclusion of these 2 groups were controversial. In fact, one of the groups obtained radius, which are typically the standard ones, for 10, 12 kilometers. But there was this analysis by Guillot and collaborators where basically they obtained very small radii. In fact, that was a problem. Now, fortunately, there is data from the NICER mission. And here the idea, as I said, so it's to measure this X-ray flux, but in this case, coming from these objects have some hot spots here with emitting in X-rays, and the idea is that if you by measuring these hot spots and basically correcting everything from relativity and Doppler effects, in principle, it's possible to obtain the radius. This is just the shape of the flux, and the dependence on the flux according to the phase of the spot model. And these are some data for instance, this is one of these two solar mass objects. In this case, in which in principle the mass is known, the radius which has been 10 is of the order of 12, 13 kilometers, with still a relatively large error bars. So not really conclusive in the end. And then there is all this other object, which in this case, the mass is not known, but in principle, from gravitational redshift is possible to obtain the ratio between the mass and radius, and then from this, using this number, also a radius of the order of 12, 13 kilometers have been deduced. Again, with a relatively large. So, okay, that is just, I mean, a combined analysis compilation of the different astrophysical data. In particular, this is the data from. So these banks are the analysis from myself, together with these different bands coming from the gravitational wave event on August 2017. So, well, these are at least the present constraints on mass and radius coming from observation. As you see, well, the radius, I think, is still a very large error bar. The mass is much well constrained, because at least we know that there are these objects with tubular masses, so, but still, it's quite important. Okay, okay, that is, I don't have much time. That will be okay, a way, I mean, how to constrain potentially the question of the spectral measurement of the radio, but I will not go into details. And well, another constraint, of course, can be obtained from the rotation. Well, Newton stars rotate very fast, as I showed yesterday, but they cannot rotate arbitrarily fast. So there is a limit for the rotation, and this limit is essentially is fixed by the quality of the centrifugal forces and the gravitational force. So if you have an object which is rotated at a frequency in which the centrifugal force is equal to the gravitational force, this is the so-called Keplerian frequency, and this is really the maximum, because if you rotate faster, the star is going to be destroyed by the rotation. So this limit, depending on whether you use Newtonian gravity or general relativity, give you a value of the maximum rotational frequency or minimum period in terms of the mass and radius. So in principle, so if you determine the rotation with high precision or whatever, in principle, this can also give you some idea of the mass and radius. So in fact, if you observe an object which is rotated with a frequency which is much larger than the corresponding Keplerian frequency, that means that your equation of state is you can throw it. Unfortunately, the point is that, as I mentioned yesterday, this is the guy which is rotating much faster today, and this value is still not enough to put really strong constraints on the equation of state. And I think I'm almost out of time. So since I'm almost out of time, okay, I will move forward. Let me just go to the final conclusion. So the conclusions are very simple. I mean, there is a lot of effort that has been done in the last year, both experimentally and theoretically, to understand the equation of the state, and a lot of effort will be done in the future. So what we know is that at least the isoscalar part of the equation of the state is relatively well constrained. Unfortunately, the isobector part, so the part that has to do with the spin asymmetry, is still not, at least, I mean, not completely well constrained. And of course, the problem is that this is related to the fact that we don't really know the nuclear force, and in particular, we don't have still too much knowledge on the spin and isospin dependence. So just to give you some, if you're interested, some books. So this is a quite complete books on nuclear many-body methods and the equation of the state. It's already quite old, but basically the methods are the same, so they are not changed. And for Newton stars, these are a few monographies where this is a very well-known and pedagogic book. It's old, it's Shapiro Tchaikovsky, but it's a very good book. So you want if you want to learn on Newton star physics, this is probably the most pedagogical one, and then okay, then you have more lesson notes.
You find more pedagogical Shapiro than the Glendale?
Well, also Glendale. Also Glendale. Well, the opinion is divided. No,
Shapiro said,
no,
this
okay.
exercise, and it's not trivial.
Well, it's not trivial. Okay, it's good. Okay. Then consider a bit. The second one is also quite very pedagogical. The last one is not so pedagogical, but is the more recent. So thank you very much for the attention, and thanks again to Christoph, to Pepe, to Juan, to Ricardo for the invitation.
Can the glitches work on the Keplerian frequency?
Glitches?
Yeah.
No, I don't. No, because the increase. I don't have. Actually, I don't know. No, the increase of the frequency is not so large in the end. I mean, the relative increase. I mean, the point is that if you put numbers on this Keplerian frequency, you can see that it's a very large frequency. So you put the typical values for the star. Well, if you take one solar mass on 10 kilometers, okay, this is point, you see, it's milliseconds, so this is very fast. You see, consider this is the fastest object that is rotating, and it's still at 1.4. So this is much less than 1. Okay, if you make the inverse, this is a very high frequency, and so the Keplerian frequency is a very large number. So it's really a limit that is. But then, if you look into the how much the frequency change with the glitches.
So this is obtained assuming rigid body rotation.
This is obtained. Yeah, because this is another question.
Yeah, because if you have a non.
If you have a differential rotation, then it's a different question.
It's like 10 to the minus 3.
It was going from 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 9 or something like that. It's the relative change. So it's very small. So this is the range of variation. It's very small. So even if you increase, okay, well, here is in units. This is, it looks like, big, but in fact it's far from the Keplerian value.
You didn't have much time, probably, and in the end, you didn't talk too much about the equation of state at the highest densities, no, in the inner core.
I didn't. Yeah, in fact, I didn't mention that. Well, at very high densities, you can have. Well, first you can have other species like hyperons or.
Yes.
Or
you question if there's any progress or on
okay, there are
solving these issues, no, concerning the hyperon.
Well, the Hyperon puzzle, I have, yeah, okay. Because, okay, I have a transparency. Right. I have another PDF, but I have to go to the USB. Okay. No. I think I will do something. Yeah, okay. Okay, I think it was here. Because that was the first version. Okay, the happens. So the problem that Pepe was mentioning is that if you have so basically on the inner core of the star, so for density is about 2 or 3 times saturation density, the composition of the star is not clear. Other particles can be present. And in particular, there are hyperons, so hyperons are simply baryons which has some strange quark. The point is that at these densities, if you look into the chemical potentials of the different species, the chemical potential of the nucleons is very large, and then it's energetically favorable to start to produce hyperons. The problem is that when you have hyperons, or in general, a new species, at least fermionic, you basically reduce the Fermi pressure of the system. It's exactly the same if you go from symmetric matter to pure neutron matter. If you replace some neutrons or protons sorry, you start from pure neutron matter and then you start to put or replacing some neutron by protons, you start to build a new Fermi sea, and then the pressure simply decreases. So this is what happens with hyperons. Now the point is that when you decrease the pressure, then since in the end of the day the pressure is trying to compensate the gravity, you are not able to support larger mass because you don't have enough pressure. So the mass is going to decrease. The total mass of the star, but in particular the maximum value. And what happens with the present models, including hyperons, is that when you put hyperons, is what I mentioned before. You have maximum masses that they don't reach this two solar mass value. So you have a problem because in one side, the energetics of the problem tells you that you should have hyperons because it's cheaper. But if you put them in the system, then you don't reach two solar masses. And then people have tried to think about possible solutions to this. This is known in the literature as the hyperon puzzle. And there are different possibilities. Of course, the first possibility is that, okay, we don't know too much on the nuclear-nuclear interaction, and probably we know much less on the hyperonucleon. So maybe it's simply because there's still something on the hyperonuclear interaction that simply will solve the problem. So it's a possibility. The second possible solution is that, okay, maybe we have to include three-body forces in the hyperonic sector. And we know this because, well, we know from standard nuclear physics that three-body forces are important to reproduce the properties of like nuclei. But as I mentioned, they provide higher pressure at higher densities. So maybe also in the hyperonic sector something similar happens. And in fact, people have included in some way because these three-body forces involving nucleons are not very easy to fix because there is almost no data. But the conclusion is not clear. In some models, all of them agree that the mass increase, but it's not. And in some models, it's enough to reach two solar masses, but in others not. So it's not so clear. So probably it's going in the good direction, but it's not clear that it's the complete solution. And then there is another possible solution is that, okay, what happens really is that before the appearance of hyperons, we simply have a phase transition to the confined matter. And then maybe this is solving the problem. And then of course, but then you have high matter, I mean, the confined matter in the star. And then new problems appear because we don't know very well the question of state for nuclear matter, imagine for quark matter. And there are problems associated with the quark matter solution is that, okay, you should have a quark matter question of state that, okay, it should give you repulsion at high densities and enough repulsion in order that the equation of state is stiff enough such that the mass is really is large. But at the same time, you have to be careful because there are channels on the quark matter where basically introduce attraction. And then it can happen that you reconfine. And then it can happen that maybe in the real center of the star, you have again baryonic matter or hadronic matter confined. So these are all other problems that appear. So, but still it's a problem which is open and unfortunately is not. Maybe the solution is simply that there are no hyperons at all.
Okay, so I think we should stop here. So we stop for just a few minutes because they are a little late, and we'll continue with the second lecture in a few minutes.
Si me dejas un USB y paso de mostrarte móviles.
¿Tuyo o es? Sí, sí. Coño.
Porque si-
He descubierto que